All right, we're ready to begin. Good evening, everyone. Thank you for coming. My name is Kiana Irvin. I'm Assistant Professor of History here at MU. On behalf of my colleagues, Dr. Gary Kramer, who's the Executive Director of the State Historical Society of Missouri, and Mary Ellen Lohman, the Senior Strategic Communications Director of the Historical Society. Welcome, thank you for coming. And as of this lecture, actually, the series turns 2 years old, if I'm not mistaken. We have hosted 14 scholars of Missouri African American history. Very proud of that accomplishment. And this, of course, could not have been done without the support of our many partners. So to the Missouri Humanities Council, to the State Historical Society of Missouri, the University of Missouri's Division of Inclusion, Diversity, and Equity, and to our many, many friends, thank you for making it possible for us to bring this program to the MU campus. So now it's my honor to introduce tonight's lecturer, Professor of History at California State University, Long Beach. Patricia Cleary earned her BA from Rice University and PhD from Northwestern University. Her research interests lie in the area of early American history. Her early research was on the intersections of gender and commerce in British America, featured in her biography of Elizabeth Murray, titled Elizabeth Murray, A Woman's Pursuit of Independence in 18th Century America, which was published by the University of Massachusetts Press in 2000, and on the National Endowment for the Humanities-funded website based on Murray's life, the Elizabeth Murray Project, a resource site in early American history. More recently, she has turned to the study of early St. Louis. As St. Louis native, she explored the complex social, economic, and political dynamics of this French-speaking outpost of the Spanish Empire in The World, the Flesh, and the Devil, A History of Colonial St. Louis, which is for sale over there. It was published by the University of Missouri Press in 2011. She's working now on researching the history of Indian mounds in the Mississippi River Valley and the roles of Indian peoples in shaping the area's society, culture, and economy in the late 18th and 19th centuries for a book project called The Destruction of the Mounds, Memory, Civic Culture, and the Indigenous Past in 19th Century St. Louis. Professor Cleary is the author of numerous book chapters and articles, including two forthcoming pieces, Fashioning Identities on the Frontier, Clothing and Cultural Cross-Dressing in Colonial and Creole St. Louis, which will be included in the volume A French City in Colonial North America, edited by Jay Gitlin and Peter Castor, also published by the University of Nebraska Press, and also The Tense and Tender Ties of Empire in the Mississippi River Valley, Illicit Liaisons in European Imperial Projects, in the volume Experiencing Empire, Power, People, and Revolution in Early America. She's also the author of two articles published by the Missouri Historical Review, The Global Village on the Banks of the Mississippi, and Drinking, Dying, and Lying to Priests, Conflicts over Authority in 18th Century St. Louis. Professor Cleary is the recipient of numerous honors and awards, including the Center for Missouri Studies Fellowship, the Mellon Research Fellowship from Huntington Library in San Marino, California, Butcher Scholar Fellowship from the Institute for the Study of the American West, and a We the People Award from the Grants for Teaching and Learning Resources and Curriculum Development Program at the National Endowment for the Humanities. So a book signing will follow the Q&A, so please purchase a copy of Professor Cleary's book. Let's welcome her to the podium.
Good evening. I want to thank Drs. Kiana Irvin and Gary Kramer, as well as John Brenner and Mary Ellen Lohman of the Missouri State Historical Society for inviting me to speak in this important series. It's an honor to be here. I titled my presentation, Making Their Marks, Voice and Violence in Colonial St. Louis, partly to acknowledge the focus that Dr. Kramer described in Race and Meaning, the African-American Experience in Missouri. In that book, Dr. Kramer charted his debt to such groundbreaking African-American scholars as Dr. Lorenzo Johnston Green, under whom he studied and began to seek out authentic African-American voices in history in general and in the history of Missouri in particular. Part of what I hope to address tonight is both the voices and the silences in the historical record of the colonial period and the effort to make African Americans visible. I begin with a time of crisis in colonial St. Louis. In 1784, people in St. Louis were suffering. Food shortages and violent fevers afflicted many, including 2/3 of the soldiers stationed in the village. According to the head of the government, Francisco Cruzat, the settlement was a veritable hospital. Cruzat pleaded with superiors in New Orleans to send medicine and food to the desperate villagers, but no aid came. And Cruzat, like many other villagers that fall, buried a family member, in his case, a 4-year-old daughter. 1785 brought no relief as the Mississippi River began to breach its banks in a flood that ultimately submerged St. Genevieve, prompting that town's relocation, and inundated fields throughout the region, destroying wheat crops and pretending the 6th year in a row of bad harvests. In August 1785, further bad news arrived with a credible rumor that Indians of various nations intended to wage war against the colonists in St. Louis. Then, in September, nearly daily fires began to break out. Officials couldn't discover the cause of the blazes and worried they might be part of a larger plan to destroy the settlement. They worried that when villagers rushed to the scene of a fire to put out the blaze, the chaos would leave the settlement exposed to Indian attack. To try to prevent that from happening, Cruzat issued a directive. He ordered that when a bell was rung or drums beaten to sound the alarm for a fire, all white men in the village would have to hurry to the site, guns in hand. All villagers who owned slaves were ordered to send them without distinction of sex, men and women alike, armed with axes and spades to battle the flames. One can picture such a scene. A warm September night, a fire breaks out. Someone rushes to ring the church bell. Roused from their bed, villagers hurry to the blaze carrying weapons and tools. Enslaved women and men find themselves on the front lines, forced to fight the flames, engulfing a wooden structure. At their backs, armed slaveholders afraid of an imminent Indian attack. Then in November 1785, a group of slaves, both Indian and African, fled the village, setting fires as they left and taking horses, guns, food, blankets, and ammunition. The runaways stayed in the area, attacking outlying settlements, and returned to St. Louis 2 days after Christmas. They hoped to persuade enslaved women to join them. Hiding one night in the barn belonging to Madame Choteau, they were discovered by the African slave Baptiste. Baptiste, Madame Choteau's right-hand man and the manager of all of her other slaves, reported his discovery of the fugitives to the master of one of the men whom he recognized. He was handed a bottle of rum, told to take it back to the barn to try to stall the men, while others hurried to try to capture them. Well, when Baptiste hurried to fulfill his task, the village militia and Spanish troops soon followed. Confusion reigned and shots rang out. Baptiste, for his pains, was among the casualties, shot through the chest at close range, killed instantaneously in the flower of his age, as Madame Choteau put it. What does a snapshot of life in the village in the 1780s suggest? Disease, hunger, natural disaster, the threat of Indian attacks, arson, enslaved people seeking freedom, gunshots in the night, sudden death. These episodes, central to the lives of St. Louisans, are part of a generally unknown past, a history of colonial St. Louis marking the lives of all of its residents and those of its African American inhabitants in distinctive ways. Baptiste, whose words reporting the fugitives are lost to us, is visible in the record because of the violence that ended his life. Tonight, I intend to show that by taking a closer look at a few incidents from this troubled period in St. Louis's early history, we can begin to recover the experiences of African Americans and to see how and where they interacted and the roles they played. Anywhere from 1/4 to 1/3 of the population of the village throughout the colonial period, they provided essential labor, suffered under the violence of slavery, and constituted an important part of its diverse society. Let me set the stage. St. Louis was founded in 1764 on the west bank of the Mississippi River. The site had been inhabited hundreds of years before by mound builders, indigenous peoples who constructed over 24 monumental earthen mounds close to the river. This early image shows the main mound complex just to the north of the location of the St. Louis Arch today. Only one large mound, an outlier, remains in existence nearby, just off Highway 55, where thousands of commuters drive past it every day, completely unaware of its existence. Just as the mounds have been raised, so too has common knowledge of their presence been largely lost. As with the generally unfamiliar history of the mound builders, the story of colonial St. Louis is little known as well, and that of African Americans within that history even less so. Most early American history concentrates on the British colonies on the eastern seaboard. Historians emphasize those colonies that became the infant United States, but that focus has begun to change in recent decades. Non-historians who think about early Missouri history may call to mind Lewis and Clark and the Corps of Discovery, that voyage and expedition that Thomas Jefferson commissioned to explore the Louisiana Territory. Too often, though, the history of Missouri before Lewis and Clark receives short shrift. Few Americans know, for example, that the westernmost battle of the American Revolutionary War was actually fought in St. Louis on May 26, 1780. At its founding, St. Louis was a small village, 3 streets wide. As you see in this 1766 image, the settlement clung to the edge of the river. Other villages nearby included Cahokia, just across the river in Illinois, and a village of Peoria Indians, just to the immediate south of St. Louis. You see the label Pancourt here, an early French nickname for St. Louis. It meant that it was short of bread. Its inhabitants were more interested in engaging in the fur trade than they were in farming the fields to raise sufficient foods. Colonial St. Louis had a diverse population from the beginning. Seeking access to the Indian fur trade and land, French merchants from New Orleans, Canada, France, and French farmers from Canada and across the river in Illinois chose to relocate and form the colonial settlement. Accompanying them were unfree Indians and Africans, as well as a handful of free Africans. Other Indians were present as well. For decades, many Indian tribes regularly sent delegations to St. Louis to visit and engage in diplomacy. Throughout the colonial era, the settlement remained quite small, barely topping 1,000 inhabitants. To put the size of the village into perspective, in 1790, New York had 33,000 people, Philadelphia 28,000, New Orleans 5,000, and St. Louis hovered just around 1,000. Predominantly French linguistically, St. Louis was primarily an outpost of the Spanish Empire for most of its colonial period. Although France claimed lands west of the Mississippi in the 1700s, it ceded them to Spain in a secret treaty in 1762, basically to keep them out of the hands of the British. This map of North America shows the shifting European claims at this time. In 1763, France lost its possessions east of the Mississippi to Great Britain as a result of loss in the French and Indian War. France regained that vast Louisiana territory in 1800 just in time to sell it to the United States a few years later. The point here is that St. Louis was perched tenuously on the edge of Spain's and then France's North American empires. At their periphery, its inhabitants really a footnote to empire, barely making a living in the fur trade and in subsistence farming. Throughout the colonial period, St. Louis was a struggling village, plagued by internal problems and external threats. European wars, local hostilities, famine, disease, and systematic as well as sporadic violence affected and afflicted afflicted villagers. This context profoundly shaped the experiences of African St. Louisans. Almost all of them were held in bondage, their lives governed by the French Code Noir, a set of guidelines written for slaveholders in France's colonies. As the Code Noir makes clear, imperial authorities envisioned African slavery as central to colonial enterprises. Indeed, they promoted it positively. For European colonists, wealth and slaveholding went hand in hand. That was clearly the case in St. Louis, where the first census in 1766 showed that the wealthiest person, Joseph Taillon, had 12 slaves. These men and women provided the labor for his fields and the labor for his flour mill. While my focus tonight is on African Americans, I want to note the continued presence of enslaved Indians in the area as well. Although Spain prohibited the Indian slave trade in the region in 1769, white St. Louisans nonetheless continued to hold numerous indigenous peoples in bondage, and the village remained important to the slave trade in Indian peoples. But how do we, to return to the title of this talk, access the voices of long dead St. Louisans, find out how they made their mark, make them visible? Recovering the lives of enslaved Africans can be very difficult. Their day-to-day existence was shaped by the sanctioned, intimate violence of an institution that deprived them of personal liberty, prohibited their exercise of civil rights, and countenanced their continual corporal punishment and sexual exploitation. At first glance, these men and women appear obliquely in official records in connection with their status as slaves, as unnamed numbers in census documents, for example. Or when listed by name, they typically appear with a monetary value assigned to them in estate inventories and marriage contracts. So what does the historical record, full of silences about their lives as individuals, reveal? What can we tease out that's meaningful from fragmentary evidence? What can we learn from a census, for example? Firstly, we know that government expectations regarding slavery went unfulfilled in colonial St. Louis. In their guidelines on how to take a census, Spanish authorities instructed their deputies in St. Louis to record the number of slaves whom they presumed to be African, and they provided a sample chart. You'll note that officials imagined a population of roughly equal numbers of white men and women and children. The Spanish wanted to settle the region with European families who would populate it with European offspring. But these same authorities imagined only half the number of enslaved women and girls as enslaved men and boys. From a European perspective, the labor of African men was the goal. A balanced sex ratio that would have facilitated family formation among unfree laborers was not at all a priority. Indeed, as indicated by this sample census, African family life was irrelevant to officials. Plans for a balanced population of European colonists and a very imbalanced population of Africans did not materialize. Rather, throughout the colonial period, there were many more European men than women and closer to equal numbers of African men and women. Those facts come as no surprise. Prior to 1800, 4/5 of all of the women who came to North America were not European. Instead, women immigrants were overwhelmingly involuntary arrivals from Africa, captured and sold into slavery. In St. Louis, among French colonists, the sex ratio was at its most skewed 5 men to every 1 woman, and at least 2 men to every 1 French woman. Among Africans, that sex ratio was much closer to being balanced, but the imbalance in power severely constrained Africans' abilities to form families. The imbalanced sex ratio in St. Louis contributed to many European men seeking sexual partners among unfree African and Indian women. who were enslaved. A small number of these sexual encounters took place within legitimate marriages between Frenchmen and Indian women, but those unions were the exceptions rather than the rule. A growing mixed-race population in colonial St. Louis was testimony to the legacy of European men coercing sex from women whose status precluded the possibility of their refusal. As an indication of how common the practice was, by the late 1770s, a majority of the children born to enslaved African and Indian women had European fathers. Typically, these men preserved their legal domination, rarely manumitting, that is, legally freeing either the women with whom they had sex or the children whom they fathered. And despite the laws forbidding this practice, there was no case of a single French man in the village ever being censored, fined, or punished in any way for having sexual relations with an enslaved woman. For enslaved Africans in colonial St. Louis, marrying and having children was extremely difficult at best. The prospect of forced separation always loomed. On one occasion, civil authorities attempted to provide minimal protection for a family by citing the Code Noir. An official refused to let a slaveholder sell mercure, who is married in the eyes of the church. He ordered the slaveholder to sell the family together, not separating a wife from her husband, or a girl from her parents before the age of 12, or a boy before the age of 14. This case aside, there is very little evidence of African marriages in St. Louis. And it's worth noting that African marriages of enslaved people required the consent more than of just the couple. They also required the consent of the slaveholder and the village priest. As the records show, some free African women and men in St. Louis were able to form families. One such woman, Jeanette Forchet, has been written about by others. She came to the village as a free woman, having been manumitted, legally freed in Illinois. She received one of the original land grants in St. Louis in 1765 and married Gregory, who was a blacksmith, and together they had a French-style colonial post house that they built, and over the course of several years amassed a fair amount of property, including cows and chickens. Then he died, and Jeanette soon remarried. When she remarried in 1773 to another free black artisan, Valentine, a gunsmith, her property had grown and included 7 cows, 7 calves, 4 sows, a dozen hens, and a rooster. The domestic details here highlight the economic roles that women performed in settlements like St. Louis. Production and reproduction occupied them as they bore and raised children, tended gardens, kept households, preserved produce, washed clothes, did the dairying and cooking. The members of these families, as did those of other free African Americans, entered into contracts, owned property, and supported themselves through a variety of artisanal work and subsistence farming. We know about them because of French marriage law, which allowed that husbands and wives gained in-community property rights to any property acquired during a marriage. Other free blacks who've been written about include Esther, an enslaved woman who eventually gained her freedom. Esther had an orchard on a village block, had cows in the village as well, known widely as Esther's cows. Much of Esther's story, however, is a bleak and grim one, entwined as it is with the history of slavery. Likely born in Virginia, she came to Kaskaskia, Illinois with an American family, and then to St. Louis with French trader Jacques Clamorgan. Clamorgan took Esther, then about 31, as payment for a debt, separating her in an act of careless cruelty from her 11-year-old daughter. He made her his sexual partner, later freeing her and putting various properties in her name, and then attempted to defraud her of these properties that she later farmed. In addition to the emotional trauma and the legal conflict that Esther experienced, part of what I think is striking about her life is her physical mobility, with the movements and separations that she endured, part of the violence that slavery permitted slaveholders to exercise. It's this theme of movement that I want to explore further for a few minutes. I've suggested that in their initial forced moves to St. Louis, there were repercussions for Africans' ability to form families. By examining in detail a few incidents in the late 1770s and early 1780s, I hope to trace the movements of unfree Africans within St. Louis to reveal otherwise hidden aspects of their lives. And I'm going to take a look at a case of domestic violence centered on a French couple that lived in this house. The story unfolds thusly. In 1778, Marie-Anne Laferne and her second husband, Gaspard Rubien, came to authorities' attention when he came home late one night, drunk, and started to beat her. He then began to attack her daughter, who tried to rescue her mother. Terrified, the two screamed for help, and at this critical juncture, an unnamed enslaved woman forced open the door, enabling the older woman to escape. Clad only in her petticoats, Laferne ran through the streets of the village to seek sanctuary at the government headquarters, her unnamed liberator in her side. And as they left, they would have seen in the distance the government house, which is the house that you see pictured here, and then they would have run by the church and the cemetery to get there. I have to thank Dr. Bob Moore of the National Park Service at the St. Louis Arch, who's involved in making interactive video models of Colonial St. Louis, who mocked up these images for me that would trace the midnight run these two women went on. And you'll notice the high fences around the properties, which are appropriate for a frontier settlement. When the two women arrived at this building, the residence of Lieutenant Governor Fernando de Leyva, the guard on duty called another enslaved woman, Marianne, a member of the governor's household, to escort the French woman inside. Laferne, fearing for her daughter's safety, implored Marianne to go and rescue her daughters. Shortly thereafter, when Marianne returned to the scene, Gaspard, the wife-beater, called out into the darkness, "Who is there? A black?" A corporal had accompanied Marianne and identified himself. Gaspard's response, "The women have too much tongue." These words could have applied equally to his wife and to Marianne, for it's because of Marianne's words and actions that we know what happened that evening, because of the testimony she gave. Meeting no resistance, Marianne and the corporal soon returned to the government house, Madame Laferne's two daughters in tow. It's difficult, in fact impossible, to imagine that Marianne would have been able to secure the girls if she had gone unaccompanied. So what do we take away from this sad episode in a dysfunctional marriage? Setting aside what it might suggest about French marriage law, which declared the husband lord with tremendous authority over his wife, or about the drinking habits of colonial St. Louisans, which were excessive and very problematic, this incident highlights, I think, the roles of Black women who were enslaved in the village. In her petition for a separation, Laferne declared that her husband's physical abuse of her had on several occasions, these are her words, required the interference of her slaves to protect her. That statement does not suggest that these women banded together, rather that the status of one, free and French, enabled her to order another, unfree and African, to be involved in the middle of the violence. On the night in question, one African woman intervened and then ran through the dark streets before another, Marianne, returned to the scene of the assault to rescue two terrified girls and escort them to their mother's side. The position that these women held as slaves increased their proximity to violence, whether or not it was directed at them. The following day, Marianne testified as to the night's events. Here's one of the notable cases, one of the very few cases, in which slave women offered testimony and made their mark, literally upon colonial records. "My name is Marianne. I am aged 30 years, she began. Describing the night, Marianne recalled how Madame Laferne had requested that she go save her daughters from being beaten. "I then went for them, accompanied by the corporal," she continued, "and I brought over the girls without any opposition." To this testimony, Marianne added her mark, the X of the illiterate, and two white men witnessed her signature. Gripping as the details might be, what's more striking for me as a historian is the actual sworn statement of Marianne. Although the testimony of enslaved men and women was almost always excluded, forbidden in North America, in St. Louis, as elsewhere, a localized legal culture made possible, including testimony from Black slaves when these individuals might have greater standing to establish truth than particular whites in the community. This testimony and others like it is the closest we have to the speech, to the words of enslaved Africans in colonial St. Louis. In this case, filtered as it was by the scribe who recorded her deposition, Marianne's testimony helps to flesh out the details of her existence. We see in concrete ways how her status shaped her movements as she went through the rooms of the government house, dealt with the distraught woman, interacted with the governor's wife, accompanied a corporal, got the girls back to the governor's house, and then testified as to everything that had happened with care and clarity the next day before a group of white officials. At every turn, she was in the middle of the conflict. Those of you who attended an earlier lecture in this series on the life of Celia, an enslaved African-American woman in 19th century Missouri, no doubt recall how powerful and revealing her testimony was as to the horrors of her life, as she described defending herself from her master's repeated sexual assaults. I mentioned that case to underline how little testimony of enslaved people was committed to paper. Their voices were not valued or recorded, and indeed largely prohibited by a system that attempted to render them invisible as actors, and how what does exist is replete with the violence that slavery brought to their lives. But to return to one African woman in St. Louis, Marianne. A few months later, violence came to Marianne herself, again connected to the Roubien-Laferne household. One morning in January 1779, Marianne left the governor's house with the family's washing, carrying it to the Rivière du Moulin, or Mill Creek Pond. Here you see its location on an early map. How much the soiled clothing weighed, how well she was protected against the winter cold, we don't and can't know. What we do know it was that it was a freezing cold morning and that a hole had been cut in the ice. When Marianne arrived, she found other African women already gathered. They were all there to do laundry, required by their owners to endure frigid temperatures. It's here in such prosaic details that we can see an example of the myriad ways that slavery affected individual lives and bodies. The slaveholders were elsewhere, indoors perhaps, less exposed to the elements. The women stood talking, trying to keep warm around a fire they had built, sharing in a moment of community. What happened next is not entirely clear, but what we do know is that two women, Marianne and Louison, began to argue. Within moments, their heated words had escalated into physical blows. At this point, a third woman, Laurine, entered the fray. Laurine belonged to the household of Gaspard Roubien and Marianne Laferne. Laurine and Marianne exchanged words and blows, and Laurine threw Marianne into the freezing cold water, as one deponent reported, and would have drowned her. Yet another woman came to Marianne's rescue, pulling her from the icy water, and then Laurine pushed Marianne into the fire, trying to burn her. Injured, Marianne broke away. A young French boy on the scene reported that he saw Marianne leave in tears, her skirts ablaze. This incident might have remained unknown, but Marianne's master, Lieutenant Governor de Leyba, decided to involve the law. Why, you ask? Someone had to be held responsible for the assault, as well as for the medical costs, because Marianne was unable to work. Someone would have to pay. In this moment, we see the monetary concerns of the slaveholder coming to the fore in the records, taking primacy over the physical suffering of an injured woman. As part of the legal follow-up, the slave women appeared as witnesses. Each woman had to receive explicit, written, signed consent from an owner before she could give a deposition. And each had to raise her right hand, make the sign of the cross, and swear to God and promise to the king that she would speak the truth. The first to speak, Fanchon, swore that she would do so and then launched into her testimony. After describing the morning's altercation, Fachon listened to a reading of her deposition, confirmed that it was true, and made her ex an ordinary mark, not knowing how to sign, as they described it. As you see in this image from her deposition, her ex was circled with the words "mark of the said Fachon négresse" written around it. When I saw this, I got chills, because just really seeing a person's presence in the record, them making that mark, was really exciting for me as a historian. Two literate European men, one French, the other Spanish, witnessed her signature. Next, Melanie testified, adding that she thought perhaps Marianne had been trying to defend herself. She also provided incidental information about the fire being one that the washerwomen kept to keep themselves warm. When her testimony was read back to her, Melanie said she had nothing to change, and then, as did Fachon, made an ex her ordinary mark. After several witnesses, all but one, an African woman, spoke, the court found against Laurine's masters and held them responsible for all medical and legal costs. For her role in the assault, Laurine received a sentence of 100 lashes with a whip, 50 to be administered that afternoon and 50 the next in the village square. That brutal punishment would have seriously injured, if not killed her. Some scholars suggest it unlikely that Laurine was whipped. She was a nursing mother, and the severe sentence would have been practically a death penalty. What's striking here is the contrast, in part. 3 months earlier, Gaspard Rubien was uncensored for his brutal attack on his wife, while Laurine received a severe sentence for an attack on another enslaved woman. If she did not undergo the whipping, it would have been in recognition not of its brutality, but in acknowledgement of slaveholders' overriding financial interest in her productive and reproductive labor. Laurine is also visible in St. Louis records in relation to her labor in the first auction ever held in St. Louis in 1776 when she was 16 years old, as well as in the context of motherhood. Over the course of 2 decades, Laurine's name appears repeatedly in baptismal records and deeds as the mother of 7 children, most of whom are described as mulatto. What larger themes do these details about Laurine suggest? One is mobility. Born elsewhere, we're not sure where, Laurine came to St. Louis in her teens. Over the course of her adult life, she lived in several different households. When the last reference to her appeared in 1789, she was 38 years old in a record of the sale of herself and her 2 young mulatto sons. These details reveal that interracial sex was part of her reproductive life, though we don't know who fathered her children or what the relationship had been. But back to the incident at the Mill Creek Pond. As with the domestic abuse case, the sworn testimony surrounding the assault on Marianne makes visible a world of movement and action otherwise hidden from scholars. Enslaved women from 5 different households met on the outskirts of the village. You can see, if you recall, I think from the other image, how far away they are. They're really out there on their own. Excuse me. They engaged in conversation. Gathering on a bitterly cold morning, they cut a hole in the ice, built a fire and washed clothing, fought and helped each other. The only European colonist present was a 14-year-old boy who had been sent to help heat up water. Interestingly, none of the people who testified offered any detailed explanation for the cause of the fight. And indeed, they declared no knowledge whatsoever of any previous difficulties between the 2 women. Was there no clear cause? Did these women have a fractious history? Were their companions on that January morning purposefully creating a silence of their own in the records, not revealing fully the details of their lives and their relationships? One wonders about the countless other gatherings, unrecorded because no legal proceedings arose, that happened as African American women and men met each other and did the labor that they were compelled to do by colonial slaveholders, colonists who did not hesitate to beat them or threaten them with sail downriver to New Orleans. All the while, they were interacting and socializing and building, I think, a separate sense of community. I think that the testimony in this case, as in the other, suggests that white St. Louisans had incomplete knowledge of the daily activities and relationships of enslaved people. Their lives were at once intimately intertwined as well as profoundly separate. Redirecting our gaze to the level of the streets, to the community's physical space, we can search the historical record for evidence of enslaved people's actions and interactions. These issues of visibility, physical movement, and the creation of a separate community are what I want to pursue in my final examples from colonial St. Louis. They come not from legal testimony, as did the two cases I've just discussed, but from legal decrees designed to limit and control the activities of Africans at a time of crisis and war. In May 1780, as I mentioned at the outset, the American Revolutionary War came to St. Louis. Hastily erected defenses meant that the village was not unprotected, and the settlement survived the assault, although with very heavy casualties. In this map from the late 1700s, you can see the location of the fort, which is it was just simply a stone tower that the Spanish constructed near what's today the intersection of 4th and Walnut. Some villagers were in the fields that day when the attack began and were among the casualties, including 7 slaves. 15 other white colonists were killed, 7 people were injured, and 59 were taken prisoner, both slave and free. In the aftermath of the battle, villagers faced food shortages, endured severe weather, and grew increasingly anxious. In 1781, Lieutenant Governor Francisco Cruzat targeted African slaves as threats to public harmony, whose unruly conduct, and that was his phrase, unruly conduct stemmed from their freedom of movement. Accordingly, Cruzat declared that all slaves should not leave their cabins at night, nor, under penalty of whipping, hold any assembly at night in their cabins or elsewhere. Further, his decree dictated that slaves could not receive in their cabins other slaves except those who belonged to their own masters. If anyone unfamiliar appeared, they were to detain the strangers and report them. The surveillance and prohibitions extended to social activities, with Cruzat dictating that slaves were not allowed to dance, either by day or night, in the village or elsewhere, without express permission from their masters and consent of the government. Imagine how difficult it would be for anyone to dance if you had to get government approval for doing so. What does this order highlight? Community, sociability, assembly, all existed among African St. Louisans, and all, from the Spanish perspective, were problematic. We know of their existence, which renders Africans and their social lives visible because of state efforts to control and monitor them. A few days later, Cruzat issued yet another restrictive decree targeting Africans, this one about their choice of dress. In recent days, he declared, reports of Indian and African peoples who belonged to St. Louis dressing themselves in barbarous fashion, as he put it, had come to his attention. What barbarous fashion meant was quite specific. Indians, both free and enslaved, and Africans had begun adorning themselves with vermilion and many feathers, of the kind worn by this Osage Indian man. This portrait brilliantly captures this warrior's distinctive use of body paint, plumes, and other ornaments, both domestic and imported. Cruzat believed that those who wore such items might become unrecognizable, especially in the woods. To prevent the likelihood of cases of mistaken identity in which colonists might shoot masqueraders as suspected enemies, Cruzat issued an ordinance forbidding all savages, whether free or slave, and all blacks of this post to clothe themselves in any other manner than according to our usage and custom, either in the village or when they go into the fields or woods. In other words, Indians and Africans could not be allowed to dress
as they chose. Rather, they were to dress as did European colonists for their own safety, as Cruzat characterized it. In this context, dressing Indian raises important questions. Were these Indian and African St. Louisans, as had British colonists 8 years earlier at the Boston Tea Party, disguising themselves, sort of, intentionally, as Indians to appear, superficially at least, as Indian? Did Africans and Indians in St. Louis wish to put white colonists on notice by linking themselves through fashion to the indigenous forces that had attacked the village the year before? Were they choosing to manipulate dress to distance themselves from any affiliation with colonial peoples? Was there social solidarity among African and Indians and shared political intent? Perhaps some wished to join a visiting tribal delegation, as there were many in St. Louis at the time. While it's impossible to answer these questions satisfactorily, we can agree, I think, that fashion could be manipulated to convey meaning, identity, affiliation, and perhaps an inherent threat. As with the cases of Baptiste, Marianne, and Laurine, these decrees from August 1781 are multi-layered and revealing. On the surface, they're statements by a beleaguered bureaucrat at a time of war, trying to respond to the security concerns of some members of the community. But the combination of the two, I think, the first an ordinance designed to limit social interaction and curtail assemblies among Africans, and the second an effort to control non-European residents' appearance and dress, is powerfully suggestive. Cruzat's decrees reveal how Africans moved through the village and the surrounding fields and woods day and night, working, gathering, dancing, and socializing. Those who put on feathers and vermilion were making strong political statements, I believe. Throwing off the clothes of their oppressors, they were fashioning themselves free people of color. Recovering African voices and experiences from colonial American history is no easy feat. There were those rare individuals who were authors in the 18th century, like Phyllis Wheatley or Alada Equiano, whose literacy and journeys from slavery to freedom made possible their literary productions. Yet the overwhelming majority of Africans in the colonies were enslaved, their literacy legally forbidden, their testimony allowed only rarely. In short, the means of preserving their voices were closed to them by the legal and social structures that dictated their bondage. Their labor underpinned the viability of many settlements, St. Louis included, and they built the structures that dotted colonial cities, from the Wall of Wall Street to numerous buildings throughout North America. Yet their lives remain too little known, too historically absent. By locating these incidents, documents, and decrees I've described in the context of the unrest and violence of 18th century St. Louis, I've attempted to shed light on the experiences of enslaved African women and men in the colonial village, to use fragmentary records to make them visible, to draw attention to their actions, to try to recover their voices, remains an incomplete and imperfect project. Slavery simultaneously dictated their presence and lay the basis for the legal and social practices that minimized evidence of that presence in the archives. But their history is far from absent or silent. If we think of the many ways we use the term voice to voice one's dissatisfaction, to announce one's intentions, to express one's will, we can agree, I think, that the record reveals important aspects of these men's and women's lives and voices. The details, I hope, illuminate in part how they experience bondage physically and socially. In their roles as pioneers in creating a diverse community, they shaped St. Louis's complex racial mosaic, part of the voices and the chorus that echo from its past. Thank you.